Hi, so because of some difficulties using the video camera, we are going to just go through this presentation for those of you who were not able to come to C's on podcasting, and I'm just going to kind of talk you through it. I won't play the videos and everything for you. You're going to do that on your own time, and I'm going to have you practice some of the things that we did in class on your own, and hopefully then with your students. So to start, if you are unfamiliar with podcasting, maybe you've never listened to a podcast or you've only listened to a couple, I advise that you try out some podcasts. So, to do it with kids, we really need to make sure that we understand what it is so that we can use it in our classroom effectively. So I would advise listening to some podcasts like Radio Lab, This American Life, and later I'm going to show you a list of podcasts that are specifically for science that I would recommend you using in your class. But feel free to listen to as many different types as you'd like, just so that you can get a gist of what is the difference in podcasts, so that when you have your students start recording, you can kind of give them some examples of how they are different. So I'm going to ask you to start by watching this video produced by KQED Teach. It's run through NPR. It explains why we podcast, what podcasting is, why students should listen to podcasts, and a lot of other things. It's a great video that you might want to show your students before you do a podcasting unit so that they can get excited, because podcasting does allow for a lot of freedom. So the first thing I'm going to show you is why you would want to listen to podcasts with your students. You can't expect your students to just start creating podcasts without being exposed to listening to a lot of these podcasts on their own first. So these podcasts are full of content. I'm going to get, like I said, I'll give you a list of podcasts. Some range from 60 seconds all the way to over an hour. So really it depends on what students you're working with. You probably don't want to have your students listen to a 45-minute or an hour-long podcast the first time that you allow them to do it in the classroom. You definitely need to build up to that. But you'll see through this graphic organizer, there will be a lot of stopping, collaborating, discussing. So it's not just students with their headphones on listening to a podcast. So let's get into it. If you look at this example, everything in this Google slide deck is linkable. So you should have this open. It's goo.gl/RIJF capital C lowercase z. Now, if you have this open, you will be able to click on the links that we're going to go over today, and you're going to need those to complete your assignment. You want to go up to File and make a copy so that you can make a copy and type any notes as you go. But if you want to write on any of this, then you're going to need to make a copy. So always do that as you are accessing all of this. So we are going to click where it says From Tree to Shining Tree, and you'll see a link underneath. Go ahead and open that. Okay, these are the directions that I would give to my students. So if you do not want to use the Radio Lab podcast that I used, if you do not teach environmental science, then you're going to go ahead and just change this all out. But let's go over it as if you were the student, and you can kind of ask yourself some questions as you go. So it says you will begin by using a Radio Lab podcast to discover a scientific phenomena about the forest scientists are just beginning to understand. So the great thing about podcasts is it really is a narrative. It tells a story to students that they would not be able to experience. We can't take all of our students into the forest to dig up trees and see the underground lines, but we can expose them to a narrative of people that do that. So they still get to experience the phenomena. And the way that these podcasts tell the story really allows them to buy into that. So before I say, okay, students, go ahead and click this to open the podcast, as a class, we kind of go over what Radio Lab has as an introduction, or it could be considered kind of an abstract. So I would read this with my whole class. We talk about kind of what we are going to expect. And again, before we open the podcast, I need to set some ground rules of what it looks like while they're listening to the podcast in my class. So as they're listening, they're going to fill out this hyperdoc. So if you go ahead and click this hyperdoc and click open, then you can kind of see what they're going to do. If your students do not need sentence stems, you can go ahead and delete these. I think it is probably recommended for all of your students as they're starting out. What I did was I took the science writing heuristic and I broke it up so that as they listen to the podcast, they would do everything that they would normally do inside of a lab, but it stops them at certain sections. So if they listen to the first 2 to 3 minutes and read the abstract, they probably can develop a question. So it says, what are your questions about the interrelationship of the forest underneath its floor? I wonder what they mean by blank. You might read the abstract and develop this question as a class, or you can allow them to pause after 2 to 3 minutes and ask them to develop a question on their own. After the first 5 minutes, they can probably develop a prediction. So if you are not using my podcast, all you have to do is change what the question is about. So what are your questions about the blank hypothesis? Write a prediction statement on what you anticipate is going to occur in this podcast. You don't need to change that. So a lot of this can be used for any podcast that you want to use. I recommend that you listen to at least 5 to 10 minutes of the podcast. We did that in my session so that you get a feel for what your students are going to experience. But again, before we start the podcast, there are a couple more things we need to do. So I like to make sure that my students experience kind of a collaborative experience as they're listening to podcasts. So what I have them do is I have them open this thing called a Stoodle. What a Stoodle is a interactive whiteboard and chat for anyone that has the link. So if I'm a teacher, I go to stoodle.ck12.org and I click launch a classroom. If I did that and gave you guys the link, you could all be in this interactive whiteboard and chat together. So what I ask students is as they have questions throughout the podcast or as they are listening and visualizing that they might draw on the whiteboard, but that it's used as a place that they can communicate with others as they're listening, as a shared experience. I usually, as the teacher, go into the chat and ask questions to students to get them kind of started with their discussion, but it usually turns into a really great place for students to communicate because it's not really that fun listening to podcasts alone. You definitely want to share your knowledge with others. So that happens as we listen, and then these are just some reminders to our students to stop and that they don't have to stay on the Radiolab page the entire time, because all that's on this page really is the podcast that they'll be listening to, a picture, the abstracts that we already read, and some recommended links for further research. And we're going to use these recommended links later, so they don't need to use these. If they want to start doing some research as they're listening, they can. I suggest that students open up Google image searches so that as they are hearing words and vocabulary that they haven't been exposed to before, they have no context, they have no visual. It's not a video, a podcast is just audio, so it can be helpful for them to be able to search things as they go so that they can have a visual in their head of what it looks like. They also can open Google, regular Google search, to do some searching as they hear new phenomena. So let's go back. We are ready to start listening to the podcast. So usually what I have my students do is put their podcast in one screen, and I'm going to show you how to do this. Put your podcast in one screen, make it small because you don't really need it, and then put your HyperDoc in the other screen. This way, students can go and pause when they need to pause and play when they need to play, because they really can't be listening and writing a question simultaneously. They definitely need to pause it to be able to fully do that. And if this is a 2-day long project, allow it to be that long if it's a 45-minute podcast the first time. This podcast we're listening to is 30 minutes, and you would assume that they're stopping, they're talking, they're on the chat. It's going to take more than 30 minutes to complete this. So as they go during the podcast, they're going to do what the scientists investigated. They're going to make some observations based on what the scientists observed in the podcast. And it's really effective